two, 1, 2, 3.
Welcome to Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Wayles Browne. Today we're talking to Teresa Halpert, who is a former member of the Board of Zoning Appeals, and we'll be asking her about that somewhat mysterious concept of zoning in the city of Ithaca and in other places in our area. Teresa, yes, you were a member of the Board of Zoning Appeals, so you've seen zoning from the inside, but not everyone knows what zoning is. We often hear someone say, we cannot do such and such because of zoning, or we have to do such and such because of zoning. So can you sort of start from the beginning and say, what is zoning? What is it about?
Zoning is codes that cities have to regulate land use and land development. Not every city has it. The first one was New York City, 1916. And that was, I think, an attempt to preserve light and air as skyscrapers were developed. And so that's why you see the wedding cake Art Deco buildings, because they would go up and then they would come in, they would go up and go in. And that's how that initial zoning code thought about preserving light and air to the street below. And so that spread across the country. Then we got different kinds of skyscrapers and we started to have different kinds of open space around towers. And I think it was 1961, New York City overhauled their zoning code, and that was the last time there was a complete overhaul. And so that had more to do with cars, everyone having cars. And so they wanted parking everywhere, even in transit-oriented areas. And since then, you just have sort of tweaks every year. Ithaca started their zoning code in 1925, and I don't know the history of how many times we changed it. They're still tweaking it all the time, but it basically tells you what you can do in certain areas. So for example, residential zone here, industrial zone over there, and it regulates the land use. So what I did was I sat on the Board of Zoning Appeals, which was there to consider and grant variances. So if you wanted to do something and it wasn't allowed by the zoning, you still have a chance to be able to do it by getting a variance. So, and that is in New York State largely prescribed by state law, which instructs local zoning boards how to interpret their local codes.
Okay, start back a bit. Zoning, that means an actual law that the city
Yes.
passes or a town or village.
Ordinance.
Ordinance is the same as law, or?
I think so. I think
Yeah.
we just call them local ordinances, and they're passed by, in our case, common council,
Yeah.
or it could be the town board in a town or village. And the state has enabling legislation, which tells you what you can do with your zoning code, which basically says, if you want to, you can pass a zoning code and it is for the purpose of X and Y.
And zoning might be about one block in the city, or it might be about a whole big neighborhood in the city. Is that right?
Well, usually if you pass a zoning ordinance, it has to cover the municipality that it's for. You have different ways you can divide it up. Traditionally, it's been permissible uses. Now we're going toward what's called form-based zoning. So the modern trend is not so much about in this block or this part of the city, you can have a single family house or you can have a church and that's it. It's more about the buildings are going to look, there'll be so much green space, there'll be so much parking. And so it's more about the form. So that the idea being that urban design thrives when we look at the form of neighborhoods.
Okay, form means it could mean what shape my house can be. It has to be square, it can't be
Right.
oval or something like that.
Right, or how tall, how far back from the street, how much green space, whether you need parking, all of that stuff. So modern reinterpretations of zoning are getting away from permitted uses and getting more toward what we want the neighborhood to look like. So it could be walkable, so it could be, have public spaces and
Yeah. Uh, uh, I know in New York City, the city government sometimes requires a builder to provide a public space in front of their skyscraper or
yes.
behind their skyscraper. And
And
is that?
yes, and I think that started with, so there's incentive zoning. This is another term. And when you give incentives, you sort of give people a reward for doing something that you want, but you might not be able to make them do. So, for example, if you make a public park in the front of your building, you can have 2 more stories of height. So that would be an incentive. And then it could evolve into later, everyone needs to make a public park in front of their building. So I'm not up with current changes in New York City zoning, but in general, that's the kind of thing that happens. You get, so that's all what you can do as of right. So as of right, you just look in the zoning code and you see that you can do X and Y and Z, and then you get a building permit. But if you want to do something that isn't quite in there, you would go and get a variance.
Okay, so my house is in one of the residential zones and in College Town, and it was actually here before there was ever zoning.
Right?
So maybe if I wanted to build my house for the first time ever right now, they wouldn't let me. But because it's here now, am I okay? That is, they won't make me tear down my house and build a
Right.
different one.
So that's sometimes called grandfather rights, or I've been told it's more proper to say legacy. So you have a legacy because you predated the zoning. So it takes a few months to get a variance. So you could most like say that your porch falls down and you want to rebuild it. But now there's a setback which came in sometime after 1925 for Ithaca. So you need to have it 10 feet from the street or 5 feet, depending on where you are in the zone. And we have a whole chart of all these setbacks. You would go and get a variance and you would say, well, my house has been there since 1900 and the porch always came right up to the sidewalk and I would like to fix it so it's again right up to the sidewalk. So that would be very easy type of variance to get because it is just putting back what was there. There was a case some years ago, INHS took down a house, I think it was on Fall Street in Fall Creek, that was falling down and they wanted to rebuild it. And the porch had been close to the street, but now the setback is bigger. So they elected to not go to get a variance because it takes a few months and it's expensive. You have to pay someone to come and present it. You have to pay an architect to write up all the stuff. So so if you walk down that block, you see porch is close, then one that's set back. And so that was a time when that code came in, there was an idea that in your front yard, you would be engaging with your neighbors. And now, both before the zoning code and now, we think more that we want backyard space. So their house actually looks a little bit out of place. When Buffalo redid their zoning code, they wrote in, and this was, I think, 2017, that you could do as of right what matched the other houses on your block. So as of right, you could make your porch come out to match. So that's really coming straight out of the form-based code idea. They also got rid of their parking requirements. So it spurred a lot of development in Buffalo. And so, Buffalo, they've gotten great results from it took them about 5 years to scrap their code and write a new one. And it's the only Rust Belt city that has grown since COVID.
I wanted to ask you about that too, because I remember a lot of controversy about the need to provide so and so many parking spaces for each apartment in apartment buildings, and apparently that tenants are not so likely to keep automobiles as they used to, so we don't need that anymore. Were you there during that controversy? Were you?
I think so. So my part of it was people would come for variances if they didn't want to make like, say, an example would be you have a house and you have a garage, and our code says you can make an accessory dwelling unit. You can make a 1-bedroom apartment in that garage, but the person should have a parking space. And so you would come for a variance and you would say, there's no way to put a parking space. And I don't need it because I have this tenant already lined up who, it's right on the bus route and so forth. So then you would get that variance to not have that parking space. But at the same time, Common Council debated taking out any requirements for parking for large parts of the city. So you can do it one lot at a time. At some point, the political body can rewrite it and saying that no one needs the parking. So I think a lot of the push now in zoning is to try to make zoning reform exciting and to say we can get rid of parking and people will still build parking if their clientele, their proposed users have cars, and they're the ones who will know that.
Okay, here in the local area, there obviously is zoning in the city of Ithaca and also in the town of Ithaca, and I think also in Cayuga Heights. I remember there was a big controversy out in the town of Caroline. Should there be zoning or should there not be zoning? And some of the residents were very much against bringing it in.
Right. So I think that so Caroline is a town, and I don't know when it was incorporated. It has a lot of federal era even and Victorian era buildings. So it's got to have been there for a long time as a rural hamlet. It never had zoning. You aren't required to have a zoning code. The state law just says you can have a zoning code and this is what it can do. They never had one. So as they grow, some people say, we need a zoning code in order to make sure we don't have sprawl, make sure we don't have, industrial things springing up right in the middle of town and so forth. And then other people who say, we've been this long without a zoning code, why would we need one? And zoning stops you from doing useful things. So I don't know where that debate stands. I think the people who were against all zoning maybe didn't get elected. I don't know.
I
Last year,
think that's true. I think that's true.
okay, so maybe
there's an
they wanted
election controversy too, because some of the people who were against it changed their party registration in order to more easily get elected, but they didn't in the end
Oh, interesting.
get elected. Yeah.
So maybe there is a majority feeling that they can put in a reasonable zoning code. This is what, when I looked it up, this is what the state, our New York State if I can find it. Okay, New York State has, as I said, enabling legislation, which allows you to have zoning. And this is what they say about town, and they have city law, town law,
Mhm.
village law.
Mhm.
So Caroline's a town. So in their town law, this is what they say. I mean, there are many, many regulations afterwards, but this is the purpose and the opening. For the purpose of promoting the health, safety, morals, or general welfare of the community, a town board is hereby empowered by local law or ordinance to regulate and restrict height, number of stories, size of buildings, percentage of lot that may be occupied, size of yards, courts, open spaces, density of population, location and use of buildings, structures and land for trade, industry, residence, or other purposes, provided such regulation shall apply to and affect only such part of the town as is outside the limits of the incorporated city. So basically they're saying that's why the town may want to do it. This is the kind of thing they can do. So I haven't followed that debate too closely, but I'm guessing they want to maybe make nodes that will grow into residential neighborhoods, maybe keep other places open for farming. Maybe, I don't know, but it's interesting. It's an interesting time because I think most places are saddled with antiquated zoning codes because there were those two hotbed times, the teens and the 20s of the 1916 to 1925, and then the 50s and 60s when they're responding to the automobile age.
Yeah.
And now people are looking at these codes and seeing how they hold back a good kind of urban development. And so there's zoning kind of has a bad name, both if you're a developer and if you're a person who's interested in living in a vibrant, walkable city. So now Caroline is a rural area growing into more of a residential town. And so you've got people who are sort of like zoning bad, no zoning.
Mhm.
And maybe they don't know, maybe they're not in the majority, I don't know. But that's my take on what's going on.
Okay, well, here in the city again, um, I'm in a residential zone, and the very idea of residential zones is that based on the thought that people shouldn't live near stores and shops and businesses and doctors' offices, that
Well, I
those
think
should all be
so,
segregated out somewhere and in
because if
one
you
place in
go
the
back
city. And yeah.
to, so I have renovated a bunch of Victorian properties. And so I've researched the history of these buildings. And if you go back before we had a zoning code, it was very much walkable, and then horse-drawn carriages and early streetcars. And so you didn't want to have a mall over there. And there was always neighborhood commercial. There were always shops. There were always doctors who lived upstairs from their consulting room. And it was much more mixed. So when zoning codes came in, at that time, they saw a benefit in having residential areas. It's interesting because you could put a church pretty much anywhere. And I think this is still true in our zoning code. Like churches aren't, considered to clutter up residential neighborhoods.
Oh,
So there are also terms inclusionary zoning and exclusionary zoning.
okay, go into that a bit, yes.
So the idea of residential neighborhoods clustering together, some people think that is a part of exclusionary zoning. And exclusionary zoning is supposed to be things in the zoning code that keep neighborhoods, affordable neighborhoods from developing. So an extreme example is in the R1 zone, I don't think Ithaca has this, but I know of towns that have this. There's a minimum lot size of 2 acres. So only single family homes of 2-acre lots. So once you do that zoning, that means you can never have a duplex, an apartment building, and you relegate them to a place far away from this particular residential zone. So that's called exclusionary zoning, writing things into the zoning code that keep people that are undesirable to some people from living near them. The opposite would be inclusionary zoning, where you say, you put into your zoning code, every apartment building has to have 5% of apartments that are affordable to people at the area median.
Aha, so the zoning can include requirements on the rent of apartments?
Well, it can include requirements on affordability. It can,
Mhm.
and we tried to do this, and it's very hard to get the political will to do this. So you can do an incentive, which is an attempt at inclusionary, where you say, if you make 10% of the apartments affordable to people at this rent, you can put an extra story more than the code contemplates. You can make your building taller. So some places have success with that. So all these things are different forms of zoning reform. And I don't know of any place that had a zoning code that got rid of it. There have been places that completely rewrote their code, and there have been places that never had a code. I think Town of Ithaca has a relatively new code that is form-based now, with the idea that they want to develop sort of hamlets that are at transportation nodes. So historic districts are in the zoning and they are overlays. So there are special rules for historic districts that the municipality has decided to protect. Some places have right to farming, and that's an overlay. So it's pretty complicated, but changing and
Yeah.
becoming somewhat more exciting, because if you can enact a strong zoning reform, you can really improve quality of life and affordability.
Oh, okay, this is interesting in terms of the campaign for affordable housing in Ithaca, so that people who work in Ithaca wouldn't need to live far away somewhere and commute in. Um, so changing the zoning laws is one way to encourage affordable housing. Um,
Yes.
uh, it could be a way to encourage new housing being built that could be affordable, or maybe improving existing housing. So
I think so. There's always a little bit of a chicken and egg thing with development, because I think the city at one point thought if they made taller buildings allowed on the west end, Green Street,
mhm.
State Street, those would be more affordable, because that land was worth a lot less than the land in College Town. But once you do that, people see that they can make a lot of expensive apartments. So then the land sells for more. So just changing, I always say SimCity's a hard game. I don't know if that's still around. When my kids were teenagers, they all played SimCity, which was a computer game where you had to, be like the city manager, and if you didn't do a really good job, your city would burn down really fast. But it's once you change one thing, it affects other things. So I think, they didn't get the result they wanted, because you now have $2,000 a month apartments on West State Street, or 24 or whatever. So that's why I personally believe in inclusionary zoning, and I don't know if we'll ever have the political will to do it, because you have to combine maybe you can use incentives, but you also have to have some requirements for, so if you upzoned, which is what you call it when you say, okay, it can be 2 stories, now it can be 5 stories. We're gonna let 5, and now you don't need a parking lot. And if you combine that, to make up numbers, say those properties are selling for $1 million, the ones in College Town are selling for $5 million. Now you suddenly say, oh, but they can be 5 stories tall. Well, those are going to sell for millions of dollars because you can make 5 stories of fancy apartments. But if when you upzone it, you say, however, 20% of the apartments have to be affordable, even if you said at the current rents on West State Street, then maybe it would sell for 2 million instead of 1 million, but not 5 million. So I think we need the political will to fix our zoning, that to make it possible to house people that need to live in the city. That's,
I would very much like to see that. I
yeah,
know
but
that
it's
zoning
not
is
gonna,
only one of the factors. In building, builders also get tax abatements, and
I mean, that's another, and I think you can argue that, no, you shouldn't subsidize luxury buildings, but honestly, I don't know how, I mean, I have a lot of problems with, I don't understand the zoning of 55 and up senior housing, because to me, 55-year-old people are not vulnerable seniors who need a subsidized housing. They're people at the height of their earning power who maybe don't want children running around. And so when you limit a place to 55 and up, you're basically saying they don't have to compete on the market with 30-year-olds. They have a smaller pool, so you artificially deflate the price of that. I mean, I have a lot of problems with a lot of things. We make a lot of political choices on who we're going to subsidize. And I think people should know that zoning is a piece of this. Zoning is a tool, and it's way more exciting than you think.
Okay, this is a good generalization to wrap up with. We've been talking to Teresa Halpert, who was herself a member of the Board of Zoning Appeals for some years, and so she's seen zoning from the inside. Teresa, thank you for the information and it's called contextualization. I'm Wayles Browne for Ithaca DSA Presents.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.